Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Mr. Winston Rudder, Chairman of the Public Service Commission of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, and all commissioners, it is our pleasure to welcome you to the inaugural session of the Public Service Commission Thought Leadership Series. I am Sterling Frost, Deputy Chair of the Public Service Commission and moderator of today's proceedings. Stepping out from our traditional remit, this Thought Leadership Series is geared toward initiating a thoughtful and intentional conversation on innovation and transformation associated with the public service, with emphasis away from process toward the more important role of contributing to value delivery. The invisible blueprint that permeates everything we do is culture. And so the national and institutional challenges we continue to face are interlinked. And these linkages embody how public sector culture and national culture inform each other. Through the lens of our country's National Development Strategy, Vision 2030, the public service reform presents a leverage point for alleviating culture issues and sustainable development. Today, UETV has partnered to connect us regardless of our location, as well as to preserve the contents of our discussion for others to view at their opportune time. At the end of our keynote presentation, you will have the opportunity to engage our thought leader through questions. You may post your questions at any time using the chat feature on any of the platforms available to us today, Facebook, Zoom, or UETV. Our thought leader for this inaugural session is Dr. Derrick Brown. Dr. Brown will speak on the topic, the role of institutions in national development and the importance of human resource management. Dr. Brown is a national of Trinidad and Tobago and is currently a senior public specialist in the governance global practice at the World Bank Group. For the past 11 years, Dr. Brown has been advising governments on public sector reform and modernization, wage bill management, and improving public sector productivity. He has worked in Africa, Southeast Asia, and in the CARICOM regional system. Prior to joining the World Bank in 2010, he was Deputy Director of the Governance and Institutional Development Division, Commonwealth Secretariat, London, where he also served as the advisor on governance and development, and later as head of the Technical Cooperation and Strategic Group. Dr. Brown has authored and edited several books and journal articles on Caribbean public policy issues. He is a graduate of the University of the West Indies, both St. Augustine and Mona, the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague, and the University of Manchester in the United Kingdom, where he was awarded his PhD in 1996. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you thought leader, Dr. Derrick Brown.
Thank you very much, Dr. Frost, for those kind words of introduction. And a very good morning to the chairpersons and members of the various commissions, permanent secretaries, chief personnel officer, the director of personnel administration, and other invitees, as well as the general audience that may be tuning into this session this morning. Let me first of all say what an honor and privilege it is to be given the opportunity to kick off this Public Service Commission Thought Leadership Series. I want to commend the Commission for taking this initiative. It's an extremely insightful initiative to take at this particular point in time, not only in the in the history of the country, but in the history of the region as a whole, where I think issues of national development and the role of the public service need to be confronted in a very serious way. It is not often the case that those of us who are serving in international institutions are afforded the opportunity to contribute to the development of, or even discussions about development in our home countries. We spend all of our time working on countries far away, and sometimes, in idle moments, muse about how some of the things we've been working on would be helpful back at home. We may have strong opinions, but under the terms of our employment, must sit on the sidelines as spectators without commenting. It is therefore incumbent upon me to say, first of all, that I work on Southeast Asia at the moment and not on the Caribbean. Consequently, I'm not authorized to speak on Caribbean matters on behalf of the World Bank Group. So the views expressed during the course of this presentation are entirely mine and are in no way attributable to the World Bank Group. Second, the topic I have chosen to speak on, the role of institutions in national development and the importance of human resource management, is one that was selected in consultation with the chair of the Public Service Commission. It was thought appropriate to start off the series at a certain level of generality, while it also allows me to avoid being drawn into commentary on specific issues or aspects of the Trinidad and Tobago situation, and particularly ongoing issues that have been occupying the news and social media of late. So the topic for today is the role of institutions in national development and the importance of human resource management. We begin by asking, therefore, well, what are institutions and why are they important? This seems to be a critical place to begin at this time, when we're constantly hearing in countries far and wide that our institutions are crumbling, that they're failing us, or worse, that they're being eroded or destroyed. The former implies that the institutions are passive, inanimate objects that are being operated upon. The latter seems to suggest that there are some nefarious forces that have deliberately set out to undermine our institutions. The word institution is used in a variety of ways, with the meaning most often determined by the context of its use. Some people use the word as a synonym for organization, but it goes beyond that. Institutions are rules, enforcement mechanisms, and organizations that govern economic, social, and political interactions. Organizations or networks are a special type of institution. They have a set of rules guiding the interaction of the group and group members with each other, as well as with non-group members. So in a nutshell, institutions are what we might call the rules of the game, the humanly devised constraints that structure social interaction, according to Ronald Coase. They're made up of formal constraints, such as rules, laws, and constitutions, informal constraints, such as norms of behavior and conventions and self-imposed codes of conduct, and their enforcement characteristics. And to be clear, for differentiation, the term institutions refers to the rules of the game, whereas organization refers to the players of the game. And being economic, political, and social in character, institutions are social constructs. They're not simply a matter of technical design or administrative arrangement. Understanding how institutions are forged, how they evolve, and the conditions that ensure their successful operation, rather than avoidance or evasion, is fundamental to development. Now, for well over 3 decades, there's been a well-established connection between institutional quality and economic growth. Numerous studies by people like Douglas North, Eleanor Ostrom, the 2009 Nobel laureate in economics, Paul Romer, a former World Bank chief economist and 2018 Nobel laureate, and more recently, people like Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson, in their book, Why Nations Fail, have all shown that strong public institutions underpin successful economic growth and development. The World Development Report of 2002, entitled Building Institutions for Markets, focused on the types of institutions that are important for the promotion of markets, which we all know to be imperfect. This is not a point for debate, but is now an accepted article of faith within the development community. Although some recent contributions emphasize the importance of economic policies, such as having the right taxation policy, subsidies on research, barriers to technology adoption, and human capital development, they typically do not present any explanation for why there are differences in the policies across countries. The explanation, therefore, lies in the quality of the institutions. There isn't a country that has succeeded in reducing poverty, promoting shared prosperity, and improving the living standards of its citizens with weak institutions. One question that could be asked is which comes first? Whether growth helps create strong institutions or strong institutions produce growth. The evidence seems to point to the latter. Countries with stronger institutions tend to grow at faster rates than those with weaker institutions. The institutions that are most relevant in this context are, of course, the economic institutions, such as the structure of property rights and, in this context, the bureaucracy or the public service. And we'll return to this point momentarily. It is also important to distinguish between institutional quality and income levels. As you'd be aware, the World Bank and many other international financial organizations classify economies into low income, lower middle income, upper middle income, and high income countries. As of July 1st of this year, 2021, low income economies are defined as those with a gross national income per capita calculated using the World Bank Atlas method of between $1,045 US dollars or less than of $1,045 US dollars or less in 2020. Lower middle income economies are those with a GNI per capita between $1,046 and $4,095. Upper middle income economies are those with a GNI per capita between $4,096 and $12,695. And high income economies are those with a per capita GNI of $12,696 or more. Now, there is no correlation between GNI per capita and institutional quality. It is a fact that most low-income countries have weak institutions, but it is not necessarily the case that all high-income countries have strong institutions. Because a country's income status derives from its per capita GNI, it means that there are many countries, such as oil and gas producers or offshore financial centers, and particularly small countries, by the way, because of the size of the population, that have been catapulted into high income status, but without having the corresponding caliber of institutions that one might expect to find in a high income country. So in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, for example, with a per capita GNI of over $15,000, it is classified as a high income country, along with the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Sweden, Luxembourg, Singapore, and Korea, all members of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD. I don't have to tell you that the quality of our institutions is not on par with other high-income countries. And here I want to refer to a slide that I thought would be useful. I've prepared very few slides for this presentation, by the way, because I find slides, PowerPoint slides, to be very distracting, and I'm one of those who adheres to the view that power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. So you'll see on this first slide, which is using data from what we call the Government Effectiveness Indicator. In the World Bank, we have a set of governance indicators for all the countries across the world. And one of those is called government effectiveness. And here, what you will see at the top line is the median level of government effectiveness for high-income countries. You'll see here the upper line in gray. Here you will see Trinidad and Tobago over a period of time from 1996 to 2018. And as you can see, there is a huge gap between where the high-income countries are, the median, by the way, for high-income countries, and where we are as a high-income country ourselves. So let us also compare Trinidad and Tobago with three countries that I consider its structural pairs, what we call structural pairs, Jamaica, Mauritius, and Singapore, using the same indicator for government effectiveness taken from the worldwide governance indicators put out by the World Bank. Let me put that slide up. As you'll observe, Trinidad and Tobago's performance is well below Singapore, as well as Mauritius, and is at a similar level to Jamaica, though in recent years, Jamaica's performance seems to be improving, while Trinidad and Tobago's is declining. And here I have a few slides on this that I would like to share with you. Here we have the World Governance Indicators, Jamaica, Mauritius, Singapore. As you can see, Mauritius is almost off the charts. Singapore is almost off the charts. Mauritius close behind, improving over time from 1996 to 2010. Jamaica, you'll see running almost neck and neck with Trinidad and Tobago, but it appears to be pulling ahead. As an aside, I might just mention that the World Governance Indicators contains indicators on all of these things on the right-hand side. Voice and accountability, political stability and absence of violence, government effectiveness, regulatory quality, rule of law, and control of corruption. I'm only using the government effectiveness indicator here because I think it's the one that is most relevant for our purposes. And later on, if there are any questions, I can explain what the governance effectiveness indicator includes. Again, a different view of the same thing. As you can see, Singapore well ahead on the scale in terms of government effectiveness. Mauritius, not nearly where Singapore is, but certainly ahead. Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, again on the lower end of the scale. Similarly, a different view of the same thing. Again, you see Singapore, some distance between Singapore and Mauritius. Now, what you'll observe here is Trinidad and Tobago, the lower blue line, sorry, the upper blue line, is ahead of Jamaica at some points. But then you'll see appears to be on a downward trend here, while Jamaica seems to be moving upwards, although in the trajectory seems to suggest that they might intersect at some point. So these are some examples from the World Governance Indicators of where we are in terms of government effectiveness. Finally, just to compare us with our immediate neighbors within the CARICOM region, you'll see that our performance on government effectiveness here is superior only to Dominica, Grenada, and Suriname. So in a nutshell, our performance on the government effectiveness indicator is pretty lackluster. Now, in their paper published by the National Bureau of Economic Research entitled Institutions as the Fundamental Cause of Long-Run Growth, Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson introduced the concept of a hierarchy of institutions, with political institutions influencing economic institutions, which then determines economic outcomes. In this context, there is perhaps a cluster of 9 key sets of institutions that play a critical role in national development. Here we have a typical set of institutions, I call this a country institutional profile, that impact on the country's national economic development, on growth. Political institutions, social institutions, accountability institutions. How do we hold political institutions accountable? Center of government or public sector institutions. So the bureaucracy is here, the public services, we call it. Legal and judicial institutions, the business environment, labor market institutions, financial institutions, and finally, SOE governance and service delivery institutions. So these are the institutions that, I think for the purposes of our discussion today, we'd like to focus on, but particularly focus on the state bureaucracy, or what we refer to in Trinidad and Tobago and the wider Caribbean as the public service. Now, I'm going to use the term public service and civil service interchangeably as I go on. Please bear in mind that these are just differences in terminology, but it's the same thing we're talking about. Some countries call it the civil service, some countries call it the public service. Why is this state of bureaucracy, or why is the state bureaucracy important? Simply put, it's because the public sector is key to a country's growth, contributing to national development through the implementation of economic and social policies, the issuance of regulations, and direct service delivery to citizens. Without the help of the state bureaucracy, it is difficult, if not impossible, to implement or maintain a policy environment that is conducive to economic growth. In addition, the public sector accounts for, on average, 38% of formal sector employment globally, and public expenditure accounts for about a quarter of global GDP, of which the largest component is the public sector wage bill. This component alone accounts for approximately 25% of total public expenditure and 8% of GDP globally. In other words, the public sector is a major employer and contributor to GDP globally, and public sector wages account for a fairly significant share of all public expenditure. Given the substantial influence of the public sector on fiscal sustainability and public service provision, therefore, balancing priorities between growth-enhancing expenditures and maintaining a well-functioning public sector has to be critical for any government. Now, to relate this specifically to Trinidad and Tobago, the latest data I was able to find suggests that the public sector in Trinidad and Tobago, and you may correct me if I'm wrong, employs approximately 135,000 people, of whom about 90,000 are, shall we say, public servants proper. In other words, the wider public sector employs a certain number of people, but the public service proper employs about 90,000. The cost of personal expenditure is approximately 20 billion TT dollars, which is about 40% of the budget. This is not an insignificant share of the national budget going towards the cost of human resources. So whenever we talk about national development and transformation, human resources ought to come first. It is impossible to even think about national development without factoring in the human resource, or as they say nowadays, the human capital element. Just as the development literature treats the role of institutions as settled doctrine, so too there is ample evidence to support the proposition that the role of the bureaucracy or the public service is vital to economic growth and performance. The data would suggest that bureaucracy is characterized by meritocratic recruitment and predictable, rewarding careers are associated with higher economic growth rates. This is known as the degree of Weberianness, named after Max Weber, the famous German sociologist whose work on bureaucracy is in some ways the foundation of modern bureaucratic theory. According to Peter Evans and James Roche, who have written extensively on the subject, the degree of Weberianness is a reliable predictor of growth, even controlling for differences in initial per capita GDP, human capital, and other variables used in standard growth models. Using regression models to analyze data collected from 30 semi-industrialized economies and 5 poorer economies between 1970 and 1990, Evans and Roche attempted to draw a correlation between the percentage change in unexplained growth, and the Weberianness of the bureaucracy. And their findings lend credence to the notion that competent, cohesive bureaucracies contribute to economic growth in some countries, while at the same time their absence explains low growth rates in other countries. The results of more recent empirical analyses corroborate that finding, that meritocratic-based recruitment contributes to better overall competence and performance of the bureaucracy, reduces corruption, and produces less biased public policy knowledge. Building on the work of Evans and Roche, three scholars from out of the Nordic countries, Norway and so on, Agnes Cornell, Karl Heinrich Knudsen, and Jan Theorell, found as recently as 2018 that the relationship between Weberianness and growth may be contingent on particular stages of economic development or relative economic development vis-a-vis other countries. In other words, different constraints can be binding at different levels of development or at different points in time in a country's development. And they argue that the degree of Weberianness of the bureaucracy may matter more as investments become more complex in terms, for example, of the technology and coordination required, and contend that while many studies point to the relationship between bureaucratic quality and economic growth, there are some that point to the reverse relationship. That is, that economic growth over time induces good institutions rather than vice versa. Or alternatively, institutions and economic performance may be mutually reinforcing. So as you grow, your institutions strengthen. I pause here to reflect for a moment on whether this has been our experience in Trinidad and Tobago. This is perhaps the sharpest insight into the current conjuncture that we face in Trinidad and Tobago. The robust growth that we experienced since the turn of the century has now caught up with a public service that has adjusted itself to somewhat lower levels of performance and lower expectations. The challenge today, therefore, is in adjusting the formal and informal incentive structures within the public service to up the ante, as it were. Now, to be clear, when we talk about a meritocratic public service, what are we talking about? The key feature of a meritocratic public service is that it restricts politicians' power over their administrative agents. Meritocracy is understood as broadly comprising a number of forms. In the narrow Weberian sense, it refers to a career-based public service with entry through competitive exams and government by principles of political neutrality. The main elements of a Weberian ideal type bureaucracy would entail three things. First, hierarchical organization with clearly delineated lines of authority and areas of responsibility. Second, impartial decisions based on clearly codified rules. And third, public officers who are meritocratically selected, having expert training and advance or progress in their careers based on objective criteria. Of course, I don't need to tell anyone on this call that the concept of merit has been used extensively to guide modern public service management around the world. The merit principle in recruitment and promotion was advocated in the influential report on the organization of the permanent civil service, the now famous, the very famous Northcote Trevelyan report way back in 1854, that was instrumental in introducing merit in the British civil service. The report suggested dividing between intellectual and mechanical work in the bureaucracy, to recruit through open, competitive examination, and to promote civil servants based solely on merit rather than on seniority. Max Weber promoted this concept in his writings, but without using the exact term. For Weber, public offices are for independent, competent experts to work in and not to be exploited for rent or favors. But the term meritocracy was put into the lexicon by the British sociologist Michael Young, who defined it as intelligence plus effort. That is, as opposed to aristocracy, which is by birth, or plutocracy, which is by wealth. It is meant to be the hallmark of modern bureaucracies, where public office is a place for proper profession. Young described meritocracy as a competing society that accepts equitable gaps in income, wealth, and social position, taking into consideration talents, merit, competencies, motivation, and effort. Overall, we can infer that meritocracy is a policy that reinforces the notion of equality of opportunity and competence, as it rejects patronage, nepotism, corruption, and incompetence for entering the public service. It is a system that values the principles of competition, open selection, careful evaluation of qualities, and having a set of qualification standards and an established recruitment process, rather than arbitrary appointment of individuals to public service positions. Today, meritocracy in recruitment is associated with having educational qualifications, passing general entrance exams, and satisfying position qualifications. In many cases, this is accompanied by panel interviews and psychological testing. For promotion processes, it is associated with performance-based assessments of individuals with clear performance expectations and indicators to measure actions and results of work. Now, this discussion of bureaucracy and meritocracy, brings us directly to your door, Mr. Chairman, because the Public Service Commission, as indeed all the other service commissions created under the 1976 Trinidad and Tobago Constitution, exist for the purpose of safeguarding the merit principle. Having hopefully persuaded you that the quality of institutions is important for development, and that among the range of institutions we could look at, the bureaucracy or the public service plays a central role, what I want to do next is to offer some international examples of public service or civil service commissions and describe the typical roles and responsibilities performed by these entities and the best practices that are followed. I'll then try to conclude with some key messages for you as service commissioners and HR practitioners to consider moving forward. The first observation I'd like to make is that service commissions differ in scope in terms of their mandates. There are three broad categories of civil service commissions found internationally. First, there are those that exercise a narrowly defined mandate, primarily focusing on recruitment only, as is the case, for example, in the United Kingdom, Ireland, and Canada. Secondly, there are commissions that also include either disciplinary control of the public service, such as in Sri Lanka and India, talent management, as is the case in Singapore, or setting guidelines and consultation in their functions, such as obtains in Nepal, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. Third, some civil service commissions have an expansive set of roles and responsibilities covering issues such as recruitment, development of the civil service, determining terms and conditions of employment, civil service data and payroll management, disciplinary control, and performance management. And there are examples of this in places like the Maldives, in Bhutan, Australia, here in the United States where I am, Zimbabwe, and Israel. Secondly, here are some examples of the key roles and responsibilities, as well as best practices of civil service commissions. The first thing I'll touch on is on recruitment and promotions. I'd already mentioned safeguarding the integrity of recruitment and promotion decisions and ensuring the non-partisan, merit-based nature of the public service being a key task performed by civil service commissions around the world. This includes organizing civil service entrance examinations, conducting candidate interviews for both hiring and promotion, and monitoring ministries to ensure that HR rules and regulations are being followed. In countries where recruitment is heavily centralized, such as, for example, in Belgium, Hong Kong, Canada, and the UK, this is the most important and even the only task performed by a Civil Service Commission. Training and development. Supporting the civil service by taking an inventory of training needs and institutional capacities, and offering training and development opportunities for incoming and existing staff to match these needs is a critical task performed by many civil service commissions. And here I want to single out the issue of induction training. You know, when people are joining the civil service for the first time, it's really very important that they be socialized into understanding the norms and mores of the civil service. And I think it's important that this be done by some central authority rather than be left to the ministry into which they're being deployed, because these things differ. And there needs to be a common set of standards and norms across the entire civil service. I think the Civil Service, or the Public Service Commission in our case, is the ideal body to take up this particular responsibility of making sure that new entrants drafted into the public service receive the kind of induction training and exposure to the ethics of public service that would make them, fully aware of what is right, what is wrong, what is acceptable practice and behavior as they embark on their role as public servants, as public officers. The U.S. Civil Service Commission carries out competency modeling for line agencies. So in other words, they're helping the line agencies to develop the competencies and profiles for the jobs that they would like to fill, allowing agencies to identify critical needs and gaps for training, development, and recruitment. In the Philippines, where I've been working for the past 4 years, the Civil Service Commission actually has a training arm called the Civil Service Institute, which is the main provider of training for the almost 1.3 million civil servants that they employ in the Philippines. The civil service population in the Philippines is the equivalent of the entire population of Trinidad and Tobago. Third, strategic human resource management. In countries where recruitment and promotion decisions are delegated to line ministries, the Civil Service Commission often takes on a high-level strategic role, focusing on improving overall policies relating to human resource management in government units and agencies. Australia and the United States are two relevant examples where civil service commissions that advise and regulate government entities in areas of recruitment, skills development, and staff or manpower planning. In coordination with line ministries and the Statistical Office, the Civil Service Commission can play a pivotal role in determining what kind of staff are needed, how many, and where. Performance management. Many civil service commissions play a critical role in enhancing government performance. This may be done through creating and strengthening a performance culture, as is the case in the United Kingdom, undertaking performance audits and reviews, for example, here in the United States, or setting performance standards, as is done in Hong Kong. And then, of course, there's disciplinary control. In many countries, the Civil Service Commission is the main disciplinary body of the civil service, as well as the final appeals board. Singapore, even Afghanistan, at least before the United States troops left. As a disciplinary body, it oversees discipline and possible dismissal for misconduct. As an appeals board, it deals with civil servants who dispute decisions made about, for example, promotions, salaries, and so on, or who think they have not been treated fairly and impartially. Related to this is work done on promoting a culture of integrity and ethical behavior in the civil service and the implementation of a code of conduct. I want to emphasize this again. I mentioned earlier the induction training and the issue of training in ethics. And I think this is really an important thing that needs to be addressed. I'm not sure where and how it's being addressed at this time, but it's something that I think needs to be addressed in the public service. There are a few cases of civil service commissions being involved in setting pay policies for the civil service, or having a kind of gatekeeper function in relation to new recruits, where the allocation of new staff has to be approved by them before line ministry can hire new employees. So that's a kind of establishment control function. In addition, many countries have found unique functions for their civil service commissions on top of the standard roles and responsibilities that I've already mentioned. The Belgian Civil Service Commission, for example, organizes a horizontal mobility program, encouraging a whole of government view among civil servants. So moving people around, rotation and so on, rotation policy that allows people to move from one ministry to another and to get a more holistic view of the civil service and not just a narrow view based on the place where they happen to be located. The Irish Civil Service Commission aids in the recruitment of top managers for local authorities. And in the United States, the Civil Service Commission is responsible for administering the federal retirement program and for vetting new civil servants for security clearances. I worked in Ghana several years ago, and the Civil Service Commission there took the lead in doing a payroll audit that resulted in the weeding out of substantial numbers of ghost workers and the reduction in the payroll. When I started working on Ghana, they had just entered an IMF program. And one of the sore points with the Ghanaian government at the time was that the civil service, the public service, was consuming something like about 60% of the national budget. So every year, the budget was presented to Parliament, and 60% of the resources were being used to pay public servants. And they needed to figure out how to bring that down. 60% is just way too high because it leaves very little money for consumables, for materials and supplies, as well as for capital expenditure. Anyway, whatever its functions, formal as well as informal, it should be clear that the Civil Service Commission, or in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, the Public Service Commission, lies at the very center of the human resource management system in the public service. But it is not the only player. And so cooperation and coordination with other actors is going to be necessary if the Commission is to fulfill its mandate and to introduce lasting reforms. One of the things I have observed, something that is very peculiar to civil service commissions in many countries, is that they are very bad at collaborating or cooperating with other relevant departments who also play a role in public sector human resource management. And I think this stems from the fact that they are usually constitutional bodies appointed by the head of state and are intended to be independent. And so they try to protect their independence by insulating themselves to avoid compromise. But independence and isolation are not the same thing. And too many civil service commissions tend to become isolated, to the point where if you do a survey of senior public service managers or executives in many countries, many of them will identify the Civil Service Commission as the major bottleneck or stumbling block that affects their ability to deliver on their programs. But this news almost always comes as a surprise to the Commission. They're usually the last to recognize that they're screwing up. But as the Civil Service Commission sets policies and guidelines for the human resource management across line ministries and agencies, it will inevitably have to cooperate with those organizations and carry out audits to enforce those guidelines and ensure that they're being properly applied and complied with. Furthermore, it is only in cooperation with line ministries and agencies that the Civil Service Commission will be able to know which parts of human resource management need to be improved. So, in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, for example, there are several parts of the government bureaucracy that are relevant as they play a role in the HRM function in the public sector. And I think some of these are with us on this call today. There's the Chief Personnel Officer. There's the Ministry of Public Administration. I believe that the old O&M division that used to be in the Prime Minister's office of many years ago was replaced by a Public Management Consulting division, which is in the Ministry of Public Administration, and the Public Service Institute, which is the training arm of the Ministry of Public Administration. The Ministry of Finance, of course, the paymaster, the Office of the Prime Minister, particularly the head of the public service, and in his or her capacity as chair of the Committee of Permanent Secretaries. These are all relevant actors in the human resource management space within the public service, and therefore it is essential that there be constant communication, coordination, collaboration, and cooperation among these actors. Mr. Chairman, I want to end by leaving you and fellow commissioners with a few thoughts on emerging best practices where the Public Service Commission, and indeed all the other constitutional service commissions in Trinidad and Tobago, might consider paying some attention. Maybe you are already doing some of these things, I'm not aware, but some of them are maybe too far outside your mandate or indeed your comfort zone. But without meaning to sound controversial, I think we'd all agree that the Trinidad and Tobago public service of today is a shadow of its former self. There has been a steady decline in the quality of our public service, and one might surmise the quality of our public servants. Everywhere you turn, in the traditional and social media, there is an absence of trust in government. And when ordinary citizens say government, they include the public service. And a perception, rightly or wrongly, that the public service is riddled with corruption. There is also a perception that the public service is overstaffed or bloated, unproductive, and inefficient. I'm sure many of you have also heard people lamenting the caliber of public servants we have today by comparing them with some of the stalwarts of yesteryear, the Willie DeMasses of the world, Scotty Lewis, Doddridge Allain, Frank Andrenol Rampasad, Eugenio Moore, Reginald Dumas, Frank Barsotti, Ainsworth Harewood, and Louis Bryan, to name a few. I'm sure that if you think carefully about it, you might be able to discern a common thread among all of these fine public officers that is absent today. But I shan't go down that path today. When we look globally at what is happening in the public service, there are some areas where, in my opinion, as an observer, we might want to pay some more attention. I'll just highlight 5 of these. First, pardon, a focus on improving the recruitment process, recruitment systems. Merit-based recruitment, hiring based on the quality of the candidate rather than on political connections or other non-meritocratic criteria, is the very basic foundation of the Weberian bureaucracy model. The manner in which countries organize their recruitment is strongly linked to whether the civil service system is based on careers or positions. Career-based systems tend to recruit once at the bottom of the hierarchy, and candidates for internal promotions are sought within the existing pool of civil servants. Position-based systems, on the other hand, open up all new jobs to competitive recruitment. France is perhaps the classic example of a career-based system in which recruitment is organized through a centrally administered exam, which changes in content depending on how senior the specific position is, but not by professional group. This means, therefore, that applicants for a job in the Ministry of Fisheries receive the same exam questions as those for a similar job, a similar level job at the Ministry of Finance. Interestingly, China and India also have very well-established, centrally organized exams. You'll be intrigued to hear that in China, one of the main aspects of the entrance examinations for civil servants is on ideology, on thinking Chinese, on Chinese history and philosophy. The Indian civil service has a very rich history of central examinations. To participate, candidates must have a university degree and be between 21 and 28 years of age. There is a single examination for all administrative services, with the first step consisting of 2 papers, one general and one on a subject of choice. If successful, candidates then have to write 8 more papers to complete step 2. And finally, there's an oral interview to complement the 8 written tests. The result is that the Indian administrative services have developed a reputation for excellence, which in turn attracts more bright young candidates who want to apply to join the civil service. Korea, likewise, has a career-based system that combines both interviews and a central exam. The first step consists of a multiple-choice test focusing on linguistic ability and logic, data interpretation, circumstantial judgment, and command of the English language. Now, bear in mind, of course, that Koreans are not native English speakers. Higher grade entries include a second step in which the candidates take an essay-based test followed by an interview. Previously, the tests concentrated on legal knowledge, but today they emphasize job-related competencies. Secondly, strengthening the entry requirements. So first we spoke about improving the recruitment system. Now we talk about strengthening the entry requirements. The most basic factors in screening are often age, nationality, and educational attainment. But beyond these, how should applicants to the civil service be assessed? In practice, testing of general and especially legal knowledge is widespread. Psychometric tests have become very popular now. For position-based applicants, as you might imagine, testing of specialized knowledge is common practice. Multiple choice exams are criticized for rewarding those with keen memory skills based on factual knowledge. So you just have to memorize the answers, and people get past papers. You know how it works, and you know it's all about recalling the correct answer to the multiple choice. Increasingly, the preferred type of testing measures competency. Rather than a candidate's topical knowledge, broader issues are measured, such as leadership or strategic, critical, or innovative thinking. The OECD differentiates the necessary skill sets for civil servants into 4 categories: policy advice, working with citizens, collaboration in networks, and commissioning and contracting, which is basically procurement. Overarching all of these are 3 competencies: strategic thinking, professional expertise, and innovative capabilities. The importance that these competencies have for a well-functioning modern civil service suggests that they should be included in screening mechanisms. Whatever competency framework is developed, what is clear is that traditional screening mechanisms or entrance examinations are incapable of measuring competencies beyond narrowly defined professional expertise. So while topical knowledge and knowledge of the law and IQ and other personality traits might still be relevant, an emphasis on broader competencies could bring civil service recruitment to another level. One last point here before moving on. Despite solid empirical evidence showing the strong positive effects that public service motivation has on performance of civil servants, in other words, people who get into the civil service because of a keen desire to be of service to their communities, it appears that very few countries, if any, currently screen for this attribute. Third, recruitment of senior officers or leadership development. An increasing number of governments have created specific recruitment mechanisms for senior level civil servants. At the senior level, less focus is put on measuring specific and general knowledge. More attention is paid to addressing competencies, specifically skills linked to the interplay between politics, policy implementation, and policy coordination with other departments. The success and sustainability of public service departments and agencies and the country as a whole depends on the development of effective leaders. To expand both the breadth and depth of the bench of future leaders of the public service, those currently in senior positions need to have a very deep understanding of how leadership development takes place, the kinds of events leaders experience as being developmental, and the lessons they must learn to improve their effectiveness in the face of ever-increasing complexity. So there are 3 main approaches to learning: the experiential, which is largely on-the-job experiences and challenges, such as day-to-day tasks, stretch assignments or projects, special projects. Social, which focuses on developmental relationships, such as mentoring, coaching, personal networks and interactions with others. And formal, which is coursework, training programs. Now, the evidence suggests that 70% of learning and development takes place through experiential learning, 20% through social learning, and only 10% through formal classroom learning and training programs. Recent research suggests that devising practical approaches to leadership development should include 4 clusters: challenging assignments, developmental relationships, adverse situations, that is placing staff in a crisis, a swim or sink situation that has high potential for failure and negative publicity, but causes them to learn very quickly. For example, a financial crisis, a national security or public health threat, natural disasters, for example. Interestingly, in the Philippines, one of the parts or one element of the training of senior executives in the Philippines is that they are meant to go and live in poorer communities and serve those communities. They become part of the communities, and they try to do things to improve the lot of people in those communities. And finally, coursework and training. The issue of managed job rotations for rising officers is another opportunity for leadership development that I think can be more widely embraced. A fourth point, the ratio of career civil servants to contract staff. While the manner in which different countries organize their recruitment is strongly linked to whether the underlying civil service system is career or position based in practice, many countries have a hybrid system with a mix of employment and contract modalities for different occupational functions, depending on the needs of the public administration. You'll find that the ratio of career civil servants to contract employees varies significantly across countries. According to the OECD's 2019 Government at a Glance report, a common trend in most developed OECD countries is for the central government administration to be staffed mainly by statutory civil servants. In other words, career officers. The average share of civil servants in central administration across OECD countries where the data were available was about 68%. One gets a sense that the proliferation of contract staff in Trinidad and Tobago has caused us to move to operating a kind of middle ground between position and career-based systems. Now, the reasons commonly cited for using staff on fixed-term contracts include the need for to cover extraordinary or special needs or expertise, to meet urgent, unpredictable needs such as projects with limited duration, to replace temporary or absent public officers, to circumvent the sometimes lengthy procedures for creating a position, securing the budgetary allocation, and then recruiting to fill the position, and the financial reasons such as the case where cost of career officials can exceed the cost of fixed-term employees. So to be clear, international experience highlights that the fact that the use of fixed-term contracts is optimized when restricted to occupational shortages and where grounded in a strong governance framework. Fixed-term contracts are more effective when utilized strategically and selectively as one tool among a wider range of human resource management tools at the government's disposal, with clear and strict rules governing the management of this resource. In these instances, fixed-term contracts have been used to recruit highly sought-after profiles, skills that are scarce. You can't find them they're not gravitating towards the civil service. And you usually have to pay a premium. You usually have to pay something over and above the normal civil service salary in order to attract such people, which is why a contract makes sense. To fill these occupational shortages for a limited duration, because there should always be a program that allows for that person to transfer knowledge to a sitting civil servant, a career official who's going to stay after they have left. This tends to happen a lot in many countries for IT staff, by the way, people in the IT sector, because there's so many job opportunities outside there that, why do they want to come to the civil service? But they come, they stay for a short time, they build up their experience, and they move on. Let me move on quickly because I see the time is not on our side. Measuring and managing productivity or efficiency. I've been working on this recently in the case of Malaysia, which is an upper middle income country on the threshold of becoming high income. Very much concerned about improving the productivity of its public sector. The COVID-19 pandemic has forced countries around the world to undertake necessary but expensive measures to protect lives and livelihoods and to support economic recovery. Fiscal constraints have heightened the imperative for every government to improve its productivity and to try to do more with less. Of course, the productivity agenda is not new. Some of you may recall that, many years ago, we had a National Productivity Council in Trinidad and Tobago. And it has faced many challenges in the past, like, what are the right metrics that you use to measure productivity? For instance, complexities in determining the inputs and outputs of the public sector make it difficult to reach consensus within governments on how to meaningfully assess productivity. But the point is that public sector productivity has resurfaced in the post-pandemic world. Two key questions arise. A, how can governments best measure productivity and resolve the long-standing challenges? And B, how can they incentivize government agencies to engage in the process of improving productivity? I would argue that this type of work logically belongs with the Public Service Commission. It goes along with another trend that we've seen, which is that governments across the world are increasingly doing core staff engagement surveys on a regular basis, perhaps every other year, biannually, that solicit feedback on a wide range of issues such as staff satisfaction and motivation, management practices, communication, organizational culture. Dr. Frost at the opening of this mentioned culture, and that is really very important, organizational culture within the wider context of the society in which we live, and so on and so forth. This would give public officers a voice. They feel that they're expressing their views and opinions and that somebody is listening, and it would allow the Public Service Commission to better understand the challenges of the public service that it serves and to work with ministries and agencies to develop action plans that are meant to address the concerns raised by the public officers. There's much more that I can say that can be said on these issues, but I believe it's time to wind up now. I hope that I've done justice to the topic, and you will go away with some clarity on the role that institutions in general, the bureaucracy or the public service in particular, plays in a country's development. In today's world, it has become fashionable to talk about the private sector as being the engine of growth, while forgetting that while the private sector might fuel growth, it is the public sector that must drive and steer growth. A competent, motivated, and modern public service will be necessary to achieve the country's development goals. And the Public Service Commission, along with all the other service commissions, working closely, hand in hand with the other government ministries and agencies that play a role in human resource management, will have to step up its game if we're not to be left behind. So I want to end by imploring you to move swiftly to put behind you the problems of the 20th century so that you could move on to tackling the problems of the 21st. I thank you for your kind attention, and I'm willing to take any questions that you may have at this time.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Thank you for your insightful, clear, and expert presentation on the role of institutions in national development and the importance of human resource management. Chairman Winston Rudder extends his personal gratitude to you, and I quote from his chat. Thank you, Derrick, for your sterling contribution and continued interest in the sustainable development of Trinidad and Tobago. We continue to be motivated by the work you do and the extent of your research and analysis so as to treat with the critical issues of the public service at a systemic level. You have also given us new insights which will engage our thoughts and invoke the pertinent actions as we move forward. End quote. We now commence our question and answer segment. Please post your questions in the chat feature on the platform you're using, Facebook, Zoom, or UWE-TV. Our first question, Dr. Brown. How do you address the fact that someone can be recruited through merit, but still influenced by partisan politics, whether before or after their appointment, and therefore can still behave in a way that undermines a well-functioning public service?
Thank you for that question. I think one thing that we have to accept is that Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean are small societies, are small countries, and therefore the level of personal relationships that exist is unlike what obtains, for example, in much larger countries. There isn't that level of personalism. So it's quite likely or quite possible that someone can be recruited into the public service purely on the basis of merit. They're well qualified, they've met the entrance requirements and so on. But you never know a person's politics until they begin to display that. And the thing about public servants is that they're not supposed to display that. And so this is why I mentioned earlier of the need for induction training, the need for training in ethics, public service ethics. It's very important. I worked, when I was at the Commonwealth Secretariat, a country that I spent a lot of time working with or on, visiting, was Singapore. And their civil service commission is extremely strong when it comes to public service ethics. Public officers in Singapore know what is right and what is wrong. And you will find it very difficult to tempt them to depart from what is prescribed in law. They follow process, they follow procedures, they do what is right. Now, you might argue that Singapore is a very different kind of society from Trinidad and Tobago, and indeed it is. I find it's very interesting, actually, that I find in a lot of conversations with people in Trinidad and Tobago, there's a lot of talk about Singapore and why are we not like Singapore and how far ahead Singapore is. And we used to be, in the same basket as Singapore at one time, but they've just grown and moved ahead. And they attribute this to the leadership of Lee Kuan Yew, of course. But the point is that it's not just one person. Yes, leadership is important, but Singaporean public officers are selected and trained for excellence. They're also very well remunerated, by the way, particularly at the executive levels. They're paid salaries that are commensurate with their counterparts in the private sector. So they understand that their roles in society, and they understand that they're to be non-partisan, apolitical, and to make decisions purely based on what is in the best interest of the people of Singapore. I think that's where we need to be. I understand that we're a small society and that our political rivalries run deep, but I think we need to be in a place where civil servants know and understand that their loyalty, first and foremost, is to the country, is to the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you, Doc. A question coming in. For those jurisdictions that pay close attention to recruitment and strengthening entry requirements through some of the best practices you shared with us this morning, can you say what percentage of the budget is typically dedicated to these functions?
By the functions, I'm not quite sure whether the questioner means the recruitment entry requirements or the public service as a whole.
Public service as a whole, Doc.
Yeah. So the general trend, I have to say, is that as countries rise in income level, the expenditure on the public sector actually goes up. It might appear counterintuitive at first, but the fact of the matter is that as income levels go up, as the country rises from lower to upper middle income to high income, individuals in society also have higher expectations and demands of the public service. And so you have a larger number of public officers per 100,000 of the population. And you have a higher degree of expenditure. So the average, I would say, for OECD countries is about 33% of the budget being spent on the public service. But in lower income countries, it could be as low as 14%. Now, in some lower income countries, part of the problem is that they don't actually have the money to pay the civil servants. So the reason they're spending less on civil service salaries is because they're not actually paying. But in high income countries, you find that it's about 30 to 33% of budget that is spent on on the public service. And there's also, a higher ratio of public officers to population. Now, in our case, if the numbers I found earlier were correct, I worked it out to be approximately 6 to 7 public servants per 100,000 or per 100, which is a small number. In other words, this argument that our civil service is too large, when you look at it in terms of the percentage of civil servants to population, it doesn't bear out. It's not that large. The question is, what are those civil servants doing? Are they deployed in the right places? Are they in front-end service delivery? Most countries, the largest portion of the public service is the teaching service, followed by the health sector. Okay? We have a lot of teachers. Most countries, it's the same. The vast majority of public servants. In some countries, it could be as much as 60% of the public servants are in the teaching service. Then you have the health service, of course, particularly now in pandemic times. Nurses and so on are very important. So, as I said, it's roughly about 33%, 30 to 33%, and rises with income level.
Thank you, Doc. Dr. Brown spoke to disparate nature of the HRM function in the TNT public service. That is, many functions being shared among various organizations. This represents a number of challenges for strategic and coordinated HRM across the service, and of course, the effectiveness of the service and its ability to contribute to the national development strategy. Does Dr. Brown see a single HRM agency for the service a viable option for addressing this? If not, what would he recommend?
Well, thank you. That's an interesting question. And indeed, there is a disparate, disparate perhaps gives the wrong impression, but the human resource management function in the Trinidad and Tobago context is not located in a single place. As I mentioned, not only do we have a public service commission, but we've chosen constitutionally to go the route of having several service commissions. So there's a different one for statutory authorities, there's a different one for teaching service, there's a different one for the judicial and legal service. So part of the problem is that we have a multiplicity of service commissions. In many countries, there's one. There's one. I mean, I mentioned earlier that I've worked in the Philippines for the past 7 years. There's a single civil service commission that is responsible for employment across all of the public sector. And that includes the civil service proper, as well as local authorities, as well as state-owned enterprises, and so on and so forth. So all of the public service is in one civil service commission. The only difference is in the senior executive level, where there's a separate body called the Career Executive Service Board that is responsible for managing within the senior, the upper levels of the civil service, from the level of division chief up. So, we've chosen to go this route, and it has become complicated. We have the DPA who services all the commissions. We have the chief personnel officer who's responsible for terms and conditions and so on, and I believe wage negotiations. We also have the Ministry of Public Administration. Now we also have the ministry responsible for digitalization, because that's an important part of the public service agenda, moving towards a digital future. And that has implication for human resource management as well. So I think, given that we have this variety of agencies responsible for human resource management, I don't see at this stage how it is possible to revert to a single human resource management agency. What I do see is the need for more cooperation, more communication between the various agencies that are involved, so that they're all on the same page, they're harmonized, they understand who takes the lead on what, with the others being supporting actors. Okay, there are some things that naturally belong in a public service commission. There are other things that naturally belong, for example, with the chief personnel officer. So I would suggest that the solution at this point in our history is not to revisit the Constitution. There's some things we, the commissioners and the officials have control over, and that is not one. So my suggestion is that we need to improve the communication, the collaboration, the cooperation, decide who is responsible for what, stick to what you're responsible for, but make sure that there is always communication, some kind of regular meetings between these various agencies. My observation in many countries, and I'm not talking here about Trinidad and Tobago, is that public service or civil service commissions, precisely because they're constitutional bodies, tend to stand aloof and say, well, we're not talking to them because we are somehow above them. In the Philippines, the chair of the Public Service Commission occupies the rank of a minister. And so, doesn't feel that it is proper or fitting to speak to people lower down the chain. But it's important, I think, that aloofness be dispensed with, and that there is communication so that people understand what are the needs, what are the various issues that need to be addressed, who is best placed to address them, and work out strategies to address these things together. Another thing that I mentioned, which I think is worth pondering on, is the use of a staff engagement survey of some kind of feedback mechanism that allows the Civil Service Commission, the Public Service Commission, to receive feedback from across the government service, to feedback on a range of issues, on the management of their ministries, the management down to the level of the unit. I've seen this done in ways in which it can be disaggregated down to the level of the unit, so that a unit is given the feedback, the results of its unit, and said, okay, now you have to have a discussion because the evidence here seems to suggest that your manager is not doing a very good job. And if the Civil Service Commission knows that a manager in a particular ministry, in a part of a ministry, is not doing a good job and consistently is getting bad reports from his or her staff, then some action needs to be taken. Some action needs to be taken. So, I don't see moving towards a single entity, a single HR entity as being a feasible solution at this point in time. But I do think that it is important to improve the communication, improve the synergies, improve the cooperation among the various entities that have a role to play in human resource management.
Thank you. In your global experience, what has been the scope and opportunity for explicitly incorporating diversity in recruiting for the public service?
That's a very interesting question, given the nature of the society we live in. In many countries that I've worked in, there isn't the level of diversity that we have in Trinidad and Tobago. I mean, we have in our own country two fairly large ethnic blocs, which in many ways are also differently constituted, might be political blocs, and so as political parties oscillate in and out of office, the priorities tend to change. I think one way in which this is dealt with in some countries is having quota systems. I'm not in favor of quota systems because I think that what they tend to do is to lower standards. In other words, if you have a quota to meet, you might reduce the standard because people are not yet quite at the level that you need, but you need to fill a certain quota, so you admit them nonetheless. I think that's not a sensible way to do it. In our case, in Trinidad and Tobago, many years ago, I was involved in a study looking at the impact of ethnicity on the public service in Trinidad and Tobago. What we found was that what was an historical pattern of recruitment into the public service was changing, and that as the country developed and as educational attainment became more open, more widespread, it was very likely that the problem would correct itself, and that in fact the imbalance might actually go in the other direction. So I have no fear or worry about the context of Trinidad and Tobago. We also have new bodies that have been set up, like the Equal Opportunities Commission and so on, where people can make their case if they feel that they've been the victims of discrimination. So that's one kind of diversity. A second kind of diversity is, of course, the issue of gender. And I think we've done fairly well in our context in Trinidad and Tobago. I don't know what the numbers are, but I believe that there's a fairly high level of male and female public officials. I've seen quite a number of female senior public officials, permanent secretaries, and so on. So there's no question about discrimination, in my view, in gender terms. But nowadays, there's also this issue of the LGBTQ community. There's also the issue of religion, creed, and these are things that we need to address. My thinking on this is that we need to be sensitive to the diversity of the society. I've always lamented the fact that as a society, we've not had at a very early level in our school system some kind of course that teaches us as citizens of Trinidad and Tobago to understand the diversity of the society, the makeup of our society, as well as particularly the religious makeup of our society. Religious schools teach their religions. They don't teach comparative religion. And what we really need is a situation in which people are exposed to different religions, so they become sensitive to the needs of others. So from the standpoint of the public service, I would say that diversity is something that needs to be actively managed and not just taken for granted, so that instead of having just assuming that it's going to flourish into a diverse public service, we should have active measures taken, not just to promote diversity, but to promote understanding within the public service, so that people understand the society, they understand the different religious and ethnic backgrounds of the people who make up the public service and the wider society. The civil service is nothing but a microcosm of the wider society. And I think it's important that it be actively managed.
Thank you, Doc.
And there are ways to do this, by the way, and those are things that can be discussed in a subsequent conversation.
There seems to be a challenge transforming the public service from a bureaucratic one to an entrepreneurial one. How have you, in your experience, what have you seen with regard to public service commissions addressing this challenge?
Thanks. In some ways, it's almost a contradiction in terms to talk about an entrepreneurial bureaucrat or an entrepreneurial public servant. You have to ask yourself, if the person were that entrepreneurial, why are they a public servant? Nevertheless, I understand the question, and I mentioned earlier some issues around moving towards competencies, that we should be looking at individuals' competencies. And one of the competencies that I mentioned was strategic, critical, and innovative thinking. And I think if we move towards recruitment and promotion based on competencies, which I believe, in fact, you're doing, if I'm not mistaken, if you move in that direction, then you can test for the competencies that you need, particularly at the leadership levels. Because you see, the leadership influences a lot. If you have a competent, innovative leadership that thinks in an innovative way in its approach to problem solving, okay, I think that filters down the line to people, junior officers in the ranks. So if you have competent leaders who are thinking in a very innovative and, one might say, entrepreneurial fashion, how to get things done, getting things done. And a large part of getting things done in the public service is how you manage the network, how you manage interagency coordination, how you manage relations between the political and the technical. Okay, so somebody who understands how to get the technical point across with the sensitivity that is required by the political masters is very important. So I think, to my mind, looking for the right competencies and putting the right people in leadership positions so that that kind of leadership becomes the exemplar for junior officers, so they see and understand how things are done, how to think entrepreneurially within a public sector context. It's a bureaucracy with rules. So, there's just so far you can go, but there are ways in which you can think entrepreneurially, think innovatively, creatively, to get things done for the benefit both of the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago and the government of Trinidad and Tobago. So I would emphasize that the competency frameworks that are developed, how you recruit, and particularly how you fill leadership positions. Let me add one thing here, Dr. Frost. I mentioned the issue of coaching and mentoring and so on. In the most successful civil services across the world, there are well-developed programs in which senior officers are assigned to coach or mentor junior officers with leadership potential or new leaders. So, for example, you might have somebody who's rising in the system. They've been appointed as a director, and they're assigned a coach. They're assigned a mentor, somebody who's going to, give them the benefit of his or her experience, coach them, guide them. They meet in formal sessions. They have weekly or fortnightly discussions. How are things going? What have you encountered? What are the challenges? How have you dealt with them? Have you tried doing this? In Singapore, for example, I mentioned Singapore earlier. It's one of those countries where this is certainly how the leadership is developed. There's very deliberate coaching and mentoring that is organized in order to facilitate that kind of leadership development.
Thank you, Doc. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the inaugural session of the Public Service Commission Thought Leadership Series. You can look forward to more sessions in our series on a quarterly basis. Let me thank you for being an engaging audience, and we look forward to your participation in the future. I wish to acknowledge the partnership of UWI-TV, specifically the Managing Director, Ms. Jeanette Carew, and her team for their collaboration. To our distinguished thought leader, Dr. Derrick Brown. Dr. Brown, thank you for your willingness to share your wealth of experience and knowledge, which you did with expert mastery. Thank you. To everyone, on behalf of Mr. Winston Ruther, Chairman of the Public Service Commission of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, and all commissioners, thank you for your participation. Cheers.